Peter Jackson's The Hobbit trilogy may have brought Middle-earth back to the big screen, but let's be honest, it did take a lot of liberties with Tolkien's story. Adapting a single children's book into 3 epic films meant inventing new characters, rearranging timelines, and even contradicting some of the lore of The Lord of the Rings. And the result? A slew of changes that alter the narrative themes and tone that Tolkien intended. So, we've done it previously with The Lord of the Rings, and now it is time to look at the Hobbit movies and breaking down the biggest differences, contradictions, and lore-breaking changes. So, let's look at this today.
Build me an army worthy of Mordor.
Let's begin with one of the most controversial additions of them all, the elf-dwarf romance between Tauriel and Kíli. In the films, Tauriel is a sylvan elf of Mirkwood, who not only didn't exist in the book, but she also placed in a forbidden love subplot with the dwarf Kíli. Tolkien never even hinted at an elf falling in love with a dwarf. In fact, such a pairing is wholly non-canonical. Tauriel's character and her flirtation with Kíli has no basis in the book. They were added to inject a female character and a romance into an otherwise all-male adventure. Not only is Tauriel absent from the Hobbit novel, but the entire love triangle, yes, Legolas has a hinted interest too, is purely a movie invention. In Tolkien's writings, dwarves and elves have a long history of mutual distrust, certainly no star-crossed lovers. By inserting this subplot, the films shift focus away from the main quest and alter the tone with melodramatic scenes that Tolkien never penned. It may add emotional stakes for the movie, but it's a major deviation from Tolkien's stories and themes. As many fans will say, it felt more like fan fiction than Tolkien. Moving on, if you've only watched the movies, you'd think Azog the Defiler was one of Thorin's greatest enemies. On screen, Azog is a hulking, pale orc chieftain who killed Thorin's grandfather Thror and pursues Thorin Oakenshield relentlessly. He functions as the trilogy's primary orc villain. But here's the problem. Azog was long dead by the time of the Hobbit's events in Tolkien's lore. In the appendices, we learn that Azog was killed 142 years earlier at the Battle of Azanor-Bizarre in the year 2799 of the Third Age, slain by none other than Dane Ironfoot during the war between the dwarves and orcs. In the book, Azog is only mentioned as a historical footnote, and the chief antagonist of the Battle of the Five Armies is in fact Azog's son, Bolg. Peter Jackson's films resurrect Azog for dramatic effect, having him survive Azanor-Bizarre, minus an arm of course, so he can hunt Thorin throughout the trilogy. This change gives Thorin a personal arch-enemy, but it flat out contradicts Tolkien's timeline. Bolg, who in the book actually led the Goblin army in the Battle of the Five Armies, is demoted in the films to Azog's secondary enforcer. And in another major change, the films have Thorin personally confront and kill Azog during the Battle of the Five Armies, a cinematic duel on a frozen river. In the book, there is no one-on-one grudge match. Bolg is the leader, and he meets his end when Bjorn, the shape-shifting bear man, arrives and crushes Bolg to death, turning the tide of the battle. The movie gives that moment to Legolas and Thorin instead, robbing Bjorn of his big heroic deed. By keeping Azog alive and front and center, the movies dramatically alter the story's dynamics and ignore the established lore from Appendix A of The Lord of the Rings. It's a big lie in terms of faithfulness, essentially creating a new villain arc that Tolkien never wrote. Now, to pad out 3 films, many huge action scenes were invented or greatly expanded. Entertaining, sure, but completely absent from the book. A prime example is the barrel escape from Mirkwood. In Tolkien's The Hobbit, Bilbo helps the dwarves escape the woodland elves by packing them in barrels and floating down the river unnoticed. It's a stealthy getaway, no orc ambush, no dramatic fighting. In the Desolation of Smaug film, however, this episode becomes a wild river chase set piece. Armed orcs attack the floating dwarves. Legolas and Tauriel leap around firing arrows. Bombur does barrel acrobatics. It's an exciting sequence, sure, but none of that happens in the book. The entire orc chase, and the presence of Legolas in fact, who we will get to in a bit, was just added by the filmmakers. Tolkien's version was a simple, tension-filled escape, not an open combat scene. Even bigger is the forged golden statue showdown with Smaug inside of Erebor. In the film, the dwarves led by Thorin engage in an extended cat and mouse sequence with the dragon Smaug within the lowly mountain. They frantically attempt to kill Smaug by melting a giant golden statue and coating the dragon in molten gold. It is a visually spectacular climax for the second film, and completely made up. In the book, the dwarves never confront Smaug inside the mountain at all. Bilbo converses with Smaug stealthily, discovers the weak spot in Smaug's armor, and then the dragon flies off in a rage to attack Lake Town, where Bard shoots him down. The whole sequence of dwarves evading dragonfire amid giant forges and Smaug being bathed in gold is a pure cinematic invention to give the film a dramatic climax. By adding these elaborate action scenes, the barrel chase and Smaug vs the dwarves battle, and others, the movie significantly changed the story's events. They raised the stakes with video game style heroics, where the book's confrontations were much more low-key or happened off-screen. It's fun to watch, but it's definitely not how Tolkien wrote it. And whether that's for better or worse, we're leaving that up to you today. So moving on. In the Hobbit novel, Gandalf occasionally disappears on urgent business, only to later reveal that he was helping drive the necromancer out of southern Mirkwood. Tolkien didn't elaborate much on this in the book itself. Only in the Lord of the Rings appendices do we actually learn it was Sauron in Dol Guldur and the White Council, consisting of Gandalf, Elrond, Galadriel, Saruman, were the ones that ousted him. The films, however, put this subplot front and center, and take considerable liberties in the process. In the movies, they show Gandalf investigating Dol Guldur, discovering that the necromancer is indeed Sauron, and then a full-on showdown at Dol Guldur during the Battle of the Five Armies film. Gandalf, Elrond and Saruman arrive to rescue Gandalf and battle the Nazgûl and Sauron himself. It is dramatic, and Galadriel goes full power mode to banish Sauron's spirit. But none of this battle is described by Tolkien. In fact, no such scene occurs in the book. The Hobbit never even mentions the White Council explicitly. According to Tolkien's lore, the White Council had long known that the necromancer's presence and did plan their attack. There wasn't a last-minute surprise melee at an old fortress. Jackson's films compress and reimagine these events to make them climactic, and in doing so they introduce some law-breaking elements. One of these inventions is that of the tombs of the Nazgûl in the High Fells of Rhudaur. The film says after the Witch King of Angmar was defeated centuries ago, he and the other ringwraiths were somehow entombed in magically sealed graves, which are now found empty, implying that the Nazgûl have been unleashed. There's no basis to this in Tolkien's writings. The Witch King was never killed by the Men of Arnor, he fled and remained alive as a wraith until his actual demise much later, so he would have no tomb at all. The very idea of the Nazgûl being buried in graves that can be opened is a complete fabrication of the films. In Tolkien's lore, the Nazgûl were unbodied spirits bound to the ring. They weren't corpses in coffins waiting to escape. The Highfell sequence, while spooky, is pure Hollywood invention, and even die-hard lore buffs probably were scratching their heads at this. Moreover, Gandalf's captivity in Dol Guldur and the extent of his defeat is embellished. In the film, Gandalf is captured by Sauron's forces, caged, and needs to be dramatically rescued by Galadriel. His staff is shattered by the necromancer. Tolkien never details any such capture. In the lore, Gandalf did infiltrate Dol Guldur years later and found Thrain, Thorin's father, in the dungeons, and the White Council's attack never happened concurrently with Bilbo's quest, but there's no account of Gandalf being overpowered in this manner. It's worth noting that Sauron is a Maya spirit far more powerful than Gandalf in his mortal wizard form, so Gandalf losing a direct confrontation isn't impossible by any stretch, but the movie's depiction of a magical duel, with Gandalf visibly outmatched until others intervene, is just dramatic extrapolation, not from the text. Saruman's role is also shifted. In Tolkien's timeline, Saruman initially opposed attacking Dol Guldur for his own secret reasons, whereas in the film he shows up to fight, while dropping hints of his future betrayal. These are relatively small tweaks at this point compared to the Nazgûl tombs, but they show how the Dol Guldur plotline was reworked. Ultimately, the films took a vague appendix storyline of the White Council drives out the necromancer in 2941 and turned it into a set of action horror sequences. It certainly helps tie the Hobbit films into the larger Lord of the Rings narrative by foreshadowing Sauron's return, but along the way it does bend the law. In the book, Gandalf's other business remains off-page, a mysterious footnote to Bilbo's adventure. In the movies, it's an over-the-top spectacle that, while exciting, contradicts the established history of Middle-earth in several ways. Anyone who read the Hobbit novel knows it has a very different feel from The Lord of the Rings. The Hobbit is essentially a children's fairy tale, a light-hearted adventure filled with songs, humour, and a narrative voice that talks to the reader. The danger ramps up near the end, but it's never as dark or epic in scope as The Lord of the Rings. The Peter Jackson films, however, deliberately push The Hobbit towards the tone of the Lord of the Rings movies, meaning more battles, more seriousness, and more spectacle. The result is a tonal shift that arguably betrays the original charm of the book. In Tolkien's novel, much of the journey has a whimsical tone. For instance, the dwarves' rivalry with the trolls is comic. The encounter with the stone giants in the mountains is a brief, possibly mythical aside, and the narration often lightens the mood. The films do include some humour and songs. The dwarves do sing the Misty Mountain song after all, along with the dish cleaning song. But they very quickly veer into action-heavy, brooding territory. By the third movie, Jackson is delivering an almost unrelenting war film, massed armies clashing, extended fight choreography, decapitations, and so forth, far from the relatively short and sparsely described Battle of the Five Armies in the book, which Tolkien really does summarise in just a few short pages. In fact, because the films place more emphasis on grand conflict, they also inject elements of darkness and foreboding that Tolkien didn't dwell on in The Hobbit. The book barely mentions the wider threat of Sauron. It focused on the quest and Bilbo's personal growth. It's about the character, not the wider world at this stage. The movies, by contrast, they foreshadow the rise of Sauron and the impending war, all tying into The Lord of the Rings. It does make it feel more dire and weighty, and as a result, the simple, whimsical adventure becomes that sprawling epic we got. And you must consider how it did become a bit of a CGI spectacle as well. Tolkien's texts, of course, have fantastical elements, giants, talking animals, things like that. But many of these were simply left to the imagination or mentioned in passing. For example, Bilbo makes an offhand remark about fighting wild werewolves in the Last Desert, and this was likely just a fanciful expression. The movie trilogy, however, shows us enormous werewolves tunneling armies into the battlefield. And while the book's Battle of the Five Armies does include men, elves, dwarves, wargs, eagles, and goblins or orcs, the film throws in trolls and ogres of all shapes and sizes as well. The use of trolls in broad daylight during the battle is questionable in lore. Traditionally, trolls like the three Bilbo encountered would turn to stone in sunlight, but the film never gives us any reason to explain this, essentially hand-waving it away. It's just one of those examples where the movie favours cool visuals over Tolkien's established rules. So like I've said, the trilogy's tone is just made to be closer to The Lord of the Rings. The film did so well, so why not try and capture that again? The Hobbit, though, was just a very different book to start with, and I think that is where the differences are really felt. It's as though the films lost the childlike wonder and brevity of the source and replaced it with these protracted battles and CGI extravaganzas. Yes, it does make the story feel grand and tie it into The Lord of the Rings, but you could really argue in the same sense, it just undermines the original spirit. Now, another point we have to cover is Thorin Oakenshield's character arc. After all, it is so central to The Hobbit, the proud leader of the dwarves who becomes increasingly consumed by greed for his reclaimed treasure. Tolkien certainly portrayed Thorin as flawed by treasure lust, but the films really dial this up to 11, introducing the concept of dragon sickness that acts almost like a literal curse, driving Thorin to insanity. So let's unpack this for a moment. In the book, once the company recaptures Erebor, Thorin indeed becomes obsessed with the Hoard and irrationally refuses to share any of it, even to the aid of the destitute people of Laketown. He's angry when Bilbo gives away the Arkenstone, his most valued gem, as a bargaining chip. Tolkien describes that the lust for it was heavy on him, implying a deep greed that clouded Thorin's judgment. However, Thorin in the book remains more sullen and stubborn. He's angry and unreasonable, but he's not depicted as delusional or hallucinating. In his final moments after being wounded in battle, Thorin gains clarity, begs Bilbo's forgiveness for his harsh words, and redeems himself by recognizing the value of peace and friendship over gold. The movie Thorin, on the other hand, undergoes a near-psychotic break. The Battle of the Five Armies film shows Thorin succumbing to dragon sickness in a very on-the-nose way. He paces atop his golden treasure hoard, hears disembodied voices, and even experiences a bizarre hallucination of sinking into a sea of molten gold. He grows paranoid, isolates himself, and at one point nearly kills Bilbo himself. It is just so much more extreme than was made out in the book. So this change isn't exactly a lore contradiction, since Thorin does become greedy in the book, but it certainly alters the narrative tone and Thorin's character. The film gives Thorin a kind of psychological arc where he must snap out of a dark spell, visualized when he dramatically refocuses and casts aside his regal crown in the film, whereas in the book, Thorin's change of heart comes more subtly and sadly too late after he's mortally wounded. Also, in Tolkien's version, Thorin never physically attacks Bilbo. He certainly yells and threatens to have Bilbo punished for his betrayal, but he doesn't nearly throw Bilbo off a wall as we see in the movie. That really just added a layer of personal conflict for drama's sake. In short, the movies exaggerate Thorin's fall into greed, possibly to make his eventual heroic charge and reconciliation with Bilbo more poignant on screen. It works as heightened drama, but it's a noticeable shift from the book. Tolkien's Thorin was greedy and stubborn, yes, but not the gold-mad tyrant we see before the battle in the film. As a result, Thorin's noble qualities, like his leadership, bravery, and nobility, are somewhat overshadowed in the films until the very end, whereas the book balanced his pride and courage with his greed a bit more evenly. The film essentially rewrites Thorin's character arc to be a tale of almost succumbing to a curse, which is a different emphasis than Tolkien's nuanced take on how wealth can corrupt even a good leader. So at this point, I feel like we've covered a lot of the big ones, but there are plenty of other differences as well. Some small, some significant, and I feel like we should maybe just blitz through a few more of these at the end now, maybe in a little less detail. So we have Legolas's expanded role and timeline tweaks. Legolas, the Elf Prince of Mirkwood, does not appear in the Hobbit book at all. The films added him into the story logically as Thranduil's son. He could have been around, but Tolkien never mentioned him at the time he wrote The Hobbit. Movies also drop a cute but lore-bending Easter egg at the end. Thranduil tells Legolas about a Dunedain ranger known as Strider and suggests he seeks him out. However, if we're going by the timeline of the books, Aragorn would be 10, and that just wouldn't make sense at all. Then we have Beorn and the battle. In the book, Beorn the Skin Changer plays a dramatic role in the Battle of the Five Armies. He arrives in bear form at the last minute to rescue the wounded Thorin and kills Bolg himself, scattering the goblins. The film drastically shrinks Beorn's involvement. He barely gets a few seconds of screen time in the battle, dropping from an eagle and wreaking brief havoc, but nothing that impactful as like in the book. Beorn was generally underused in the trilogy, and I just kind of feel like that was a bit of a shame. But what about Mirkwood? The journey through Mirkwood in the book is long and filled with eerie touches. The dwarves twice stray from the path when they see flickering fires and elves feasting in the forest. Each time the lights vanish and the dwarves get lost and even more hungry. The films cut these episodes entirely. In the Desolation of Smaug, the dwarves basically enter Mirkwood, get confused by the forest's enchantment briefly, and are almost immediately attacked by giant spiders. There's no enchanted river and no illusory feasts leading them astray. Now, in the book, after the Battle of the Five Armies, Bard buries the Arkenstone with Thorin as a gesture of respect for the fallen king. In the film, Thorin dies regretting his greed, but the moment with the Arkenstone is only shown in a deleted scene. Because this was never included in the movie, I am counting this as a small omission, but it's notable for book readers who know the significance of that duel and Thorin's lineage. We don't even get a mention of Dain becoming king under the mountain either, even though we do briefly see him, whereas in the book, it really gives us closure that Dain Ironfoot succeeds Thorin and honours the promises to Bard and the elves. Each of these changes on its own will seem pretty minor, but collectively they show how freely the adaptation played with the source material, sometimes to flesh things out, sometimes to simplify, and often to inject drama or tie into the Lord of the Rings. For purists, it can be hard to take, but for the casual fan, they can still find lots of enjoyment. So there we have it. Tolkien's Hobbit was about a small person in a big world, using wit and luck to get by. A tale with a humble heart. The films, they turned it into a sweeping prequel to The Lord of the Rings, and that could be for better or worse. Whether you love or dislike these changes, there's no denying that they are significant. For those of us who love the lore, it's fascinating and of course sometimes frustrating to see where the movies depart from the text. But, as Gandalf might say, all we have to decide is what to do with the differences that are given to us. Now it is your turn. Which of these movie changes bothered you the most, or are there any you actually prefer over the book versions? Share your thoughts on all of this in the comment section down below. And along with this, if you would like to support the channel in other ways, please consider our Patreon. You can't always rely on YouTube itself, so this extra support will really help the channel stay strong and keep us getting that content out for you. But with that, thank you for spending just some of your time with me today, and I will see you next time on The Broken Sword.